whether it's Keel or Valet that I'm being compared to, it's like I'm not fit to tie their shoelaces. I said it once recently, like I'm tending the plants in their garden.
What are we to them?
That's a great question. I mean, I've always loved those stories of all sorts of humanoids, but UFO occupants especially, that seem just as surprised or more surprised than the eyewitness, And I love the idea that there's, there's like 4 or 5 gray aliens in another dimension smoking their equivalent of DMT and popping over here and getting surprised by these horrific tall creatures that are over here. But, I really don't know. I think that, I'm more inclined than ever to think that there's a symbiosis there. If a tree falls in the forest, doesn't make a sound. Well, if a Bigfoot wants to walk through the forest, is it there? If a UFO wants to fly across the sky and there's no one there to see it, does it? I'm not sure. So I do think that there's a symbiosis there. And I think that, I suspect that they need us, but I definitely know that we need them, because so much of what they've been doing is acting as adjuvants for myth and meaning in our lives. They're sort of carrying a lot of that baggage that we have sort of abandoned, and they've sort of picked up the slack and are carrying it forward. And I think that we really can't function without myth and without legend in those deeper parts of ourselves, which are sometimes some of the truest things. Like, I think that there are myths that are truer than what I would tell you I did today, going to the post office and go to the doctor and stuff. Like, I think that myths are that important and that true.
Hello and welcome to Fire in the Cosmos. We have a special episode today because Sinead and I are in the same room for the first time.
Yes.
And we have a very special guest, Joshua Cutchin, who's a good friend of mine and has graced us with his presence. Joshua is a full-time author and musician specializing in speculative nonfiction. He has spoken at numerous paranormal conventions throughout the U.S., appeared on hundreds of podcasts, and in 2019 was featured on the hit History Channel series Ancient Aliens. Joshua's critically acclaimed books include 2015's A Trojan Feast, the food and drink offerings of aliens, fairies, and Sasquatch, and 2020's Where the Footprints End, High Strangeness and the Bigfoot Phenomenon, Volumes 1 and 2, with Timothy Renner. He's also contributed forewords and essays to numerous other publications. In 2022, Joshua released his 2-part masterwork, Ecology of Souls, a new mythology of death and the paranormal. That year, it was included in Rice University's independent study for first-year PhD students in religion. 2024 saw Joshua serve as a producer on Ryan Grulich's documentary, Lady of the Lake. His latest book, Fourth Wall Phantoms, Reflections on the Paranormal, Narrative, and Fictions Becoming Fact, was released in April 2025. That year, he was also invited to serve as workshop assistant for Kevin Can and Dr. Jeffrey Kripal at their Esalen Institute event, The Soul is a UFO, Understanding and Embracing Transcendence. Thank you so much for joining us, Josh. And that is an amazing bio.
That's too long. It's too long of a bio. I should have just, I've been getting
you deserve the whole thing, right?
I've been kind of like jokingly just sending bios to people that just say Joshua loves monsters, and that's my whole bio. But yeah. Anyway, so apologies for making everybody sit through that. But thank you very much for that warm introduction, and it's great to be here with both of y'all.
Thank you. It's not as long as your bibliography, so we're good. We're good.
Fair enough.
Good point. Yeah, and actually, Joshua, given that you said Joshua loves monsters, you must be a fan of Guillermo del Toro and his films.
Oh, I have such a soft spot. For his stuff. His sort of journey of just like really latching on to creatures and stuff as a child really does mirror mine, because I think that's where a lot of my interests stem from. I was just a monster kid. I love a good creature feature, and GDT is someone who's I will always watch every single one of his films. Yeah,
Same.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I really enjoy how he takes these archetypes and kind of flips them on their head, and he makes us realize that the things or beings that we seem to think of as monsters might not actually be the monsters, and that sometimes we are the monsters. So I love that he plays with, our perception, which you also talk a lot about in your books, is, how we perceive things is a big part of how they become meaningful to us.
Yeah, and his work is always so thoughtful in that regard. And it's really interesting. You read interviews with him, and he's had his own share of like really odd experiences too.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he gets this, and in some ways it's sort of I think it's almost like a microcosm of what these topics are asking us to do, right? I mean, they're asking us to evaluate like what it is to be human and what it is to put ourselves in relationship with the other. And I will. It's the kind of thing where whenever he announces that he's attached to adapt a project, I always get a little disappointed because I always want to hear and see his original voice shining through. So while I would have loved to have seen his version of The Hobbit, I was very glad that fell through and we get more original content from him, because it's such a wonderful voice that I cherish.
He really is. He also, I'm in Toronto. I'm a Canadian. He loves Toronto. He spends a lot of time in Toronto, and he films there. And I just keep crossing my fingers and hoping I'm going to bump into him
someday. Yeah.
Yeah, I hope so. But listen, I wanted to ask you a question about how you got started in this space. We're talking about movies, and that's something that people are often, it tends to be a medium that helps people become inducted into this space of thinking about fantasy as possibly being real, even just in the realm of imagination. So I want to go back to when you were a kid. What were you like when you were a child? What was your experience like? And how were you experiencing the world? Were movies part of that? Can you tell us more of what you were like as a child?
That's a very prescient question. I mean, I can't really overemphasize how much movies were a part of my life as a child. My family treated the Academy Awards like the Super Bowl, like it was that sort of hallowed evening in our household. Yeah, and my father had literally like a Rolodex flip folder for all the films that he taped off of TV and exactly where to find them and whatnot. So it was always a huge part of my life. Yeah, he also subscribed to the trades like Variety and whatnot, so I got a sort of a bit more informed about the ins and outs of the industry. Yeah, so I gained a certain amount of fluency in that. Surprisingly, didn't take the cinema route though, but I think that all of that does stem from, as I sort of alluded to earlier, being a monster kid. And when you couple that with a household that is very open to a lot of topics, but also is, very much encouraging you to read, my parents used to, whenever they'd set me loose in the bookstore, they'd say, whatever you want, don't care what it is, whatever you want. And sort of that sort of openness, I think, does naturally lead you into stories about like Bigfoot and whatnot, which was, my first interest before I ever showed any interest in the UFO question. So that's always been sort of running in the background of my life. And, obviously my more recent output has sort of been engaging with the fictional a little bit more, from the Fairy Films essay collection to my novel to Fourth Wall Phantoms, which sort of marries the two things that I'm interested in. But so yeah, that was a lot of the genesis for this. And it was always sort of, every, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, maybe 5 years, I'd pick up a book on the paranormal. At one point I had an hour-long commute to work back in 2015, which was 10 years ago now, which is hard to believe.
I know.
But I was listening to there were still a lot of paranormal supernatural podcasts back then, but there were enough that you could kind of actually keep up with them as opposed to how many there are now. And so, I had made it a habit to listen to these on the way to and from work during that hour there and hour back. And it really rekindled a lot of my interest. And, I noticed some things that people hadn't talked about. And I sort of sat around and I said, well, somebody should write a book on that. And then no one did. And I was like, oh, wait, is it me? Like, is this where the universe is, reaching down and poking you on the head? Like, it's you, Josh. So yeah, that's sort of a thumbnail sketch of how I got branded with the scarlet letter that is an interest in these topics.
So would you say, like, just to touch on that a little bit more, would you say you were a sensitive kid? Like, did you pick up on, energies? What was your personality like back then?
I think I'm kind of like a baseline. Now, the experiences that I've had, the personal experiences that I've had, are probably more aligned with ghost experiences. But as far as like really sort of having something that I would call a sensitivity, I don't think I really have ever had that. And I certainly have it less now. I think the more I've gotten interested in this stuff, the less sensitive I've gotten. There was an interesting time period in my youth where our house was under, my parents were sort of renovating the house and adding on to it. So a liminal time frame. And my mother and I would find stacks of 4/4, always 4/4, in the oddest of places, like on top of the refrigerator. Or one that really stands out was behind one of those giant dictionaries on the shelf, like behind the dictionary. We for the first time in, like, I don't know, 18 months or whatever, we're looking up the definition of a word, and there's a stack of 4/4 behind the dictionary.
Interesting.
So that's kind of poltergeisty, kind of fairy sort of behavior, but it was something that, we all experienced, and it was very tangible in that regard. So, I think really what it is just that sort of openness that we had in the household. And but I wouldn't necessarily call myself sensitive or psychic in any way. These things visit me less and less, it seems, but I'm still here for them.
So Josh, I usually, when I introduce friends to your work, I like to call you a modern day Jacques Vallée a la Passport to Nagonia, like a Jacques Vallée 2.0.
See, I always get sort of verklempt whenever people say things like that, because I just feel like, whether it's Keel or Vallée that I'm being compared to, it's like I'm not fit to tie their shoelaces. I said it once recently, like I'm tending the plants in their gardens is what I like to think of.
Love that.
They planted these things and they got them blooming, and I'm like, maybe I'm doing some trimmings and planting some stuff from the trimmings or whatnot, but like it is their garden that I'm in, so I always want to sort of emphasize that.
That's great. So do you mind sharing with the audience, like, your trajectory? Where did you start in approaching these phenomena, and where do you think you've landed now? And I know it's a fluid and continuing process for you.
No, it is fluid and continuing. And like, I would like to think that if you are so masochistic as to read all my books back to back to back, you would see sort of a progression of the way that I've thought about these things. Well, there's a lot of different ways we could take this question. Oddly enough, I was absolutely terrified well into my 20s of the possibility of quote unquote alien abduction, to the extent that I couldn't even look at like a cartoon of a gray alien. It would kind of freak me out. But it wasn't until I really started reinvesting in some of that, that paranormal podcast space, that I started to see all these similarities between altered states of consciousness and the alien abduction question, or the UFO contact question is probably a better way to put it. And I think that naturally instilled sort of an interest in an interdisciplinary sort of perspective, or a pan-paranormalist sort of perspective. In addition to that, one of the things that sort of set me off writing my first book, A Trojan Feast, was that I noticed similarities between some indigenous Bigfoot folklore regarding taking food from a Bukwas, their version of Bigfoot, and being trapped with them forever, and being like, oh, that sounds a lot like Western European fairy folklore. If you take food from the fairies, you're trapped in fairyland forever. And that was my aha moment, where it's like, these two cultures, we are told, have not cross-pollinated until, the quote-unquote discovery of the New World. So, like, why is there this very specific motif between them? So I think all that sort of set me up for this, like, big umbrella version of the phenomenon, as I've tended to see it, which is that I leave plenty of room to be wrong, and I admit that I might be wrong. These things might be manifesting in similar ways and be wholly different. I mean, I need oxygen and water to live, and so does a shrimp, but we're very different things, right? So I leave room for that, but I suspect that these are all sort of faces on the same thing. If I had to hold my feet to the fire and ask what I think, all different faces of the same thing, because I do see so many similarities across different contact modalities. Things from sounds to smells to impressions to really odd details, like the sort of trope of a spouse not being able to be woken up during an alien abduction. You'll see that in fairy folklore. I've found it plenty of times in Bigfoot stories. It's really weird, specific stuff like that makes me go, okay, like what are we dealing with here? Like, why is that so similar and so specific? So I do sort of find myself as a pan-paranormalist. My inner 12-year-old wants there to be extraterrestrials, and my inner 12-year-old wants Bigfoot to be a giant undiscovered primate, but I am not so sure now. And that, as you alluded to, has been sort of ebbing and flowing in my interpretation of the phenomenon. For a while, I thought it was all fairies, whatever that means, which sort of, was back then probably I was interpreting it more as like elemental spirits or genus loci or spirits of the land or something like that. But over time I've softened to something that I really never appreciated or liked is the idea that we should probably position ourselves at the center of these phenomena more than we do. I hated the idea that any of this stuff was coming from us, not in the sense that it's hallucinated or it's all in people's heads, but like that we are co-creating in that sort of way.
Yep.
But I see more and more of that now. And that's sort of what led me into the trajectory of Ecology of Souls, which was the idea that these things are all tied to death. Some of them might be our departed. Some of them might be other things charged by the creator with escorting us into the afterlife, the technicians of the soul or whatnot, something along those lines. And I'm still quite sympathetic to that. But, my latest book, Fourth Wall Phantoms, I don't think it tosses that out completely, but it sort of adds another dimension, which is this sort of manifestation of fiction in our reality. I kind of wonder if the world of imagination, the imaginal, to put it more specifically, if the imaginal and the spirit world and the afterlife aren't all the same thing, that, that's why it's so important to keep people's memories alive, right? Is because it might be literally sustaining them in some sense. But that's sort of where I've come to now, is sort of a blend of those two models, that these things center around death, but our relationship to this other space, whatever it is the same relationship that we see with the imagination and the imaginal and fact and fiction and the psychic. Honestly, I think I said this, you were in New York, Anthony.
Yep.
I think I said this at the end of my thing there, and it found its way into Fourth Wall Phantoms. I think that we are predominantly physical with an important component that's psychic. Maybe it's 80-20. I don't know. I think that a lot of these things, the UFO in particular, but a lot of these things like Bigfoot and fairies and ghosts and whatnot, I think they're predominantly psychic with an important component that's physical. Like they sort of are our mirror image of us. And they, that's the only way that I can sort of reconcile the ephemerality of these things and how mercurial they are with the fact that they do deposit slag and metamaterials and leave burn marks in the ground and cause witnesses to have sunburns and stuff like that. Like that's the only sort of way that I can sort of square that circle and reconcile it. So that's sort of a very convoluted thumbnail sketch of where I am. But I try to hold a lot of my interpretations of these topics with an open hand rather than a closed hand. And granted, some days my fingers are a little bit tighter than others, but for the most part, it's an open-handed approach to these topics. Yeah.
Thank you. I have one more question, then I'll hand it over to Sinead. With that approach and that thinking, in your opinion, what are we to them?
That's a great question. I mean, I've always loved those stories of all sorts of humanoids, but UFO occupants especially, that seem just as surprised or more surprised than the eyewitness, And I love the idea that there's, there's like 4 or 5 gray aliens in another dimension smoking their equivalent of DMT and popping over here and getting surprised by these horrific tall creatures that are over here. But, I really don't know. I think that, I'm more inclined than ever to think that there's a symbiosis there. I am not sure that, if a tree falls in the forest, doesn't make a sound. Well, if a Bigfoot wants to walk through the forest, is it there? If a UFO wants to fly across the sky and there's no one there to see it, does it? I'm not sure. So I do think that there's a symbiosis there. And I think that, well, I suspect that they need us, but I definitely know that we need them, because so much of what they've been doing is acting as adjuvants for myth and meaning in our lives. They're sort of carrying a lot of that baggage that we have sort of abandoned, and they've sort of picked up the slack and are carrying it forward. And I think that we really can't function without myth and without legend in those deeper parts of ourselves, which are sometimes some of the truest things. Like, I think that there are myths that are truer than what I would tell you I did today, going to the post office and go to the doctor and stuff. Like, I think that myths are that important and that true. So, yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. I love a lot of what you just said. I have 5 million questions just from what you just said. But I really appreciate that you talk a lot about meaning, and we're living in a time right now where people seem to be searching and seeking and needing meaning a lot more, because of the way the world is, frankly, right? Like we're more disconnected from ourselves, from each other, from nature. And people are seeking for meaning, and you are offering that to them in a way that is, very holistic, that allows for a lot of different dimensions of humanity to be at play at the same time and can be considered in a very holistic way. So I want to help to just starting off in a kind of more simpler with a simpler question. I want to help people to feel grounded in what you're talking about, because this is a topic that is so anomalous, for lack of a better word. So how would you explain what anomalous ecology is? I really appreciate that you use the word ecology a lot. That's a really important term. You use it so well. And what would you say anomalous ecology is?
Yeah, so I think that when I really sit down and interrogate why I do what I do, which is something that I try to take stock of every now and then, because it's like, why do you do this, Josh? I think a lot of what I'm trying to do is to sort of push against materialism and physicalism and the deprivation that those have brought of meaning in our lives. So I really appreciate you highlighting that. But also what I also find myself pushing against are low resolution ideas. By that, I mean that there is this tendency when we, coming from especially in America, coming from a culture that has a lot of Christian, Abrahamic, more broadly, baggage to it, there is a tendency to look at everything through this sort of binary of good and evil. And if you start to suggest that the UFO phenomenon is metaphysical, people retreat to that sort of position of, oh, it's all spiritual warfare rather quickly. And they start to talk about, well, if it's not a demon, it's an angel. Or if it's not an angel, it's a demon, right? And that is so low resolution and in a binary that I don't really want to engage in. So the implementation of a phrase like ecology and introducing that into the conversation really does highlight, I think, that there can be metaphysical forces. And again, I don't even know what that means. Is it spirit? Is it another dimension? I don't know, but whatever. There are things that do not abide by our physical reality rules and laws that, yeah, there are good ones and yeah, there are bad ones, but I think there's a lot of stuff in between. Just as an ecology has a bunch of niches that need to be filled with everything sustaining the greater whole and fulfilling an important duty, I think that the spirit world, the metaphysical world, the interdimensional world, what have you, also probably exhibits that same diversity. And so what that does is I think it allows you to sort of pivot and say, well, this anomalous thing, whatever it may be, really, did something bad to me, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad.
Mm-hmm.
Tornadoes and sharks are not evil, but their interests don't align with yours. You know what I mean? So the idea that there's a lot of things in between whose interests may not align with yours, and probably a lot of things, quite frankly, that can be swayed towards doing good or doing wrong, I think is a more nuanced way of looking at this sort of ecology of spirit or souls that we seem to be faced with when we engage with the anomalous.
Wonderful. Okay. And then what you just touched on makes me think of what you just went into, makes me think of fear, and how fear is often like, it could be a warning sign, but it can also be an invitation into something, right? Into something that we're not familiar with, the unknown in some way that can seem very scary, seem very frightening, like what's underneath the ocean. You use sharks as an example. And people are scared of the water. They don't want to go into the ocean. They're afraid of what's in there. But, the ocean is very symbolic of consciousness. And we're afraid to go into our own fears, right? We're afraid to investigate them and discover what they really might be. And often fear is an invitation to another form of power or realization or knowing of some kind. So I wanted to ask you, expanding further on what you just said, how would you say, and also maybe including death, because we're so afraid of fear. I'm a death doula. I'm fascinated by death. I think it's so important that we talk about that. How would you say that these innate fears that we have, including perhaps of death, how do they come into play in people's experiences as possibly, well, how do they manifest? That experience of fear, how does it manifest for people when they're having these experiences? And do you find that they lead into more possibility for people, or like what are the typical reactions when they experience something that is so unfamiliar and jarring and perhaps scary? Do they walk towards it? Do they feel like they don't have a choice but to experience it? Do they run away from it? What happens? Can you describe that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. What you said sort of puts me in the mindset of an observation that Patrick Harper made a while ago, comparing fairy lore and UFO lore. He made an allusion to the exodus of the fairies, which has really been happening for centuries. It goes all the way back to Chaucer, but they never really seem to leave. But you've seen this motif in like Tolkien and stuff, right? The elves going into the west, and he said that the fairies are always going, but never gone. And the the ufologists and a lot of the disclosure crowd says the UFOs are always coming, but never here. And that sort of put me in the mindset of like, something can be a catalyst for or a representation of its inverse, even though it doesn't seem like that. So to that extent, I think that a lot of these sort of incredibly negative, but really just fearful, I guess, is a better way to put it. These fearful experiences can be a catalyst for something incredibly transformative and incredibly miraculous and something that you would want. I mean, I don't want to belabor this point, but the beginning of Fourth Wall Phantoms, I talk about my my rock bottom, checking myself into recovery for alcoholism, and in the experience, in the subsequent years of being involved in the recovery community as I have been, the people who have really integrated their rock bottom, which in no uncertain terms is the worst thing ever. The people who have really integrated that wouldn't trade it for the world because of the rebound that it facilitated and the way that it allowed yourself to adapt and to change. So I think that is an important thing to keep in mind whenever we're faced with these experiences. And typically the fear that people experience is a fear of the unknown. I've often compared it to taking a pet to the vet or taking a child to the pediatrician. Like, that can be the worst thing that's happened to them all year, but it really is for their good. They just don't quite realize it. So I think that plays a component too. But really what I see in a lot of these experiences, which, you're sort of asking about how death sort of looms large, I think that there is something about our relationship with whatever this other presence is that requires grand gestures, and it requires grand sacrifices, I think, because my own, recovery experience was apparently, according to my friend Laura Bruno, who's writing a fascinating book on near-death experiences and astrology, it could have easily been a near-death experience. Like, I was due for that. And instead I chose to go into recovery. But I still had these wild synchronicities afterwards that were sort of like a response to that down payment of a life change, because there was a death there, like something, I gave up the thing that I gave up my favorite thing in the world. Right. And like that prompts a reaction in kind. So I think that plays a role in this, on a more sort of concrete sort of level. A lot of what my work Ecology of Souls was looking at was the fact that, like, Dr. Kenneth Ring put near-death experiences in dialogue with UFO contact and pointed out a lot of similarities. Dr. Eddie Bullard pointed out that shamanic initiations have a lot in common with a lot of UFO experiences, especially the classic alien abduction scenario of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And, some near-death experience scholars like Gregory Shushan have said that certain cultures don't share NDEs because they view them as shamanic initiations. There's that idea of crossing over a threshold and coming back changed. So obviously we've got this, this sort of dialogue that could be constructed between these different things, between shamanic initiation and UFO contact and near-death experiences. And similarly, a lot of people who were kidnapped by fairies came back with similar sort of abilities, as you see in those other three expressions. So, like, how far does this go?
Yeah.
And it does flirt a little bit with sort of a reductionism and a flattening out of these phenomena. But what I was trying to sort of illustrate with that was the fact that there is this other space that we go to, where if we can come back and integrate those lessons, it's a lot like the recovery process, actually, but we can go to that other space, pass into it, and come back and retain those lessons, we can improve our own lives and the lives of those around us. And I think that the people who are faced with the unknown in their day-to-day life have an opportunity that most of us don't get until the end of our life, and obviously towards the end of our life, we don't come back from that. But I do suspect that perhaps this all is representative of us slipping into a same or similar spaces from which we can sort of recover great knowledge and improve the lot of the rest of us on this side of the veil. Because that's the thing, right? I mean, near-death experiences, as my friend Sarai Ascath says, they're not they're not for that side of the veil. They're for this side of the veil, right? And, you know, you have these people who don't have near-death experiences, and you're like, well, that must mean that there's nothing on the other side. And it's like, or, you know, they didn't need those lessons as much as the people who do retain memories of their near-death experiences. So I hope that goes some way to sort of addressing your question there.
I love that. That's wonderful. I mean, I love that you're highlighting, I'm going to turn it over to Anthony, but I love it that you're highlighting that death is not just the end of the body. It sounds like you're speaking about death as a process we can go through when we're alive, not just with near-death experiences, but there's so many different kinds of death and transformation that comes with it. So
absolutely. Yeah. And you know, it's kind of funny. My editor and good friend, Barbara Fisher, said to me, she's like, you know, the book's subtitle is not right. You know, she's like, it's about death and life and rebirth. Like, that's really what Ecology of Souls is. And she is right. I mean, that's sort of also embedded in that ecology phrase that, you know, I use too. It's like that idea of the cyclicality of things. And I'm quite bullish on the idea of reincarnation and things like that. I think that there's been some great work that's been done in terms of that research. So yeah, I do think that this is not an end. It's an inflection point for sure. But I don't think that death is an end in that regard, regardless of which belief system you ascribe to.
So, Josh, this your new book, Fourth Wall Phantoms, is a pretty whopper of a book. It's pretty massive, as usual, which I love.
I don't love it. I'm mad at myself. I want to write smaller books, but a time will come. A time will come when I return. Yeah.
For those who have not undertaken the feat yet, can you give a quick synopsis, walking us through the book?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So it's a little bit of a bait and switch, right? What gets people through the door is the idea that there are these stories that really no serious researchers want to deal with, which are that people see fictional characters. Famous example is Alan Moore supposedly saw his creation, John Constantine, but there are tons of experiences like this. They seem to happen more for authors and creative types, but people who are consumers or audiences of that media also bump into fictional characters. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to explore not only those stories, but also similar stories in the spheres of ufology, cryptozoology, and parapsychology, and say, like, well, if this is the thing, like, if this happens, what does that possibly teach us about the phenomenon and how the phenomenon reacts? And it also is an opportunity to explore this concept of breaking the fourth wall, or as narratologists would call it, metalepsis, which is what these characters are essentially doing, right? Except in a more dramatic way than those fourth wall breaks that we see when a character addresses the audience. These are breaking the fourth wall, literally stepping into our reality. Mm-hmm. And there's so much in that concept, but it all more or less boils down to, you know, violations of the threshold of this hierarchical reality. And the fact that once you realize that you are in something that is illusory, once you cross that threshold and you start interacting with these orchestrating forces, you can kind of gain the system and change reality as it is around you. Mm-hmm. Now, specifically regarding, you know, three domains that I focus on, ufology, parapsychology, and cryptozoology, it does seem to me that there's a strong possibility that there is an objective component to each of these experiences, but they're also engaged in sort of a cyclical dialogue with our culture. Yes. So, I mean, a classic example, right? A great scholar in the UFO space. Back it up, Josh. Start over. In the UFO space, two people who have sort of championed this idea more than any others are Bertrand Mayust and Martin Kottmeyer. You know, Martin is one of my favorite UFO scholars, and he has pointed out rather compellingly that the first examples of engine or technology interference from a UFO, something that's become a trope and almost expected in a lot of these UFO contact stories, originated in the sci-fi pulps. You know, as far as like a mad scientist from another planet coming here and shutting down all the technology on Earth or things like that. It predates the first instance of that in the ufological record, which he pinpointed at the Level M sightings of Texas. All fine and good. I agree. Martin did his homework. But at the same time, is that not a variation on the idea of a ghost blowing out a candle, right? It's the idea of this supernatural other that's interfering with our technology. It's interfering with our way of changing and shaping the world. And you know what? I'm sure Martin could come up with the first example of that appearing, I don't know, in the Bible or in some sort of old folk tale or something. And then I would point to something else. And so it's just this sort of like this cyclical Ouroboros, this game of one-upsmanship, leapfrogging from fiction to fact to fiction to fact to fiction to fact until you probably wind up at something like petroglyphs, right? Which is so far in our history as a species that it's like, well, is that art or is that a representation of life? I don't know. It just sort of is. And I think that we see something like that with a lot of, at least in the UFO space, certainly in these other spaces that I've talked about, but where the phenomenon will co-opt an aspect of our fictions or an aspect of our storytelling. And then it'll become part of this cycle where, oh, well, we start reporting that and it gets reinforced through our fiction and then it sort of reinforces itself. I think that's relatively evident to me in the way that the UFO shape has changed from era to era, from the steampunk airships to the flying saucers to the triangular UFOs to the drones. Now we got drones everywhere now, as well as the occupants sort of changing through time. I think that we are sort of contributing to this in some way as well.
Definitely. And Anthony, did you have a follow up on that?
Yeah, actually. So the notion of myth and all of these, how do you view something like the mythopoetic element of these phenomena, like you're discussing, in relation to the next step, which, in my opinion, is something like AI? Where do you think that will take us?
Well, I think the first thing that we've got to do is we've got to acknowledge the importance and the power and the strength of myth. I mean, I sort of alluded to this earlier, but I'd like to sort of provide a little bit of a demonstration here. I was, through a series of circumstances, at the Ark experience in Kentucky, which is a creationist-based interpretation of Noah's Ark. And there's an entire room at the Ark experience dedicated to dismantling and discouraging storybook, children's book tales of Noah's Ark, those happy, sweet little stories about Noah's Ark, because they said that it diminishes God's word and it makes it seem like a fairy tale. And that was a real light bulb moment for me, because the problem isn't treating some of these stories, these myths. I say that as a Christian, these myths as fairy tales. That's not the problem. The problem is the way that we treat fairy tales. And the problem is the way that we have sort of demonized that word of myth, right? Instead of saying, oh, this is something that's so true, it's timeless, we've instead said, oh, it's something that our dumb ancestors thought was true, right? Which is completely the wrong takeaway. What's more is I get so tired of people who, especially in religious spheres, try to, Jesus walked on water because there was a sandbar out there, and the Red Sea was parted because there was a once in a lifetime current of air that parted the. These are not the games that we should be playing. If your faith is shaken by the impossible, you have no faith at all. So I think that there's a lot of things in there that I just claimed that can be applied to things like myth and things like the UFO experience. And just the fact that you reach a certain point, you just got to go, these things happen. Like people see fictional characters, people, are taken aboard craft. I don't know if that means it's a one-off that just happens for them in this tiny paracosm or something, but these things do just happen. Now, that becomes a concerning question when you look at the way that AI is sort of rewriting things. I think it's kind of funny that we're getting the most breakthroughs in disclosure during an era where no one will accept any visual evidence now. I think that's just like, that's so poetic in a tricksterish way. I mean, I know it's frustrating for the people who want to prove the reality of UFOs, but like, isn't it perfect? Isn't it kind of perfect that these things coincide? Like, it's just trickster time in that sense. So I think that's something to be concerned with. I think that there are lessons to be learned, though, from like the way that we see these large language models operating. I mean, I feel like they are sort of akin to the collective unconscious, the way that they're sort of trawling through all of our data and all of the supposedly the mass of everything that's been written. Now, granted, they hallucinate more often than not for me, but still, it's interesting to sort of see how there are how an application of what's basically a Jungian model is kind of at the forefront of technology. I find that fascinating. And, I to the extent that I'm talking about the UFO phenomenon changing and adapting, I got a little bit of grief for one of my good friends back around the time of the Tic Tac in 2017 when that was disclosed, for saying that, we're going to get drones now, because as I said, the UFO phenomenon has changed shape over time. And I said, oh, we're going to get drones. And he was like, but we don't have drones, Josh. Where are the drones? Well, December of 2024 rolls around, and And, I don't know what that stuff was. I think some of it was terrestrial. I think some of it was genuinely anomalous. But the point is that there has been a synthesis of drone and UFO in the public consciousness, right? And so I think that it's been kind of exciting to see that aspect of, it's been exciting to see that play out in real time. Another sea change for the UFO, for the actual UFO craft sort of shape. The occupants, I'm not really sure what they're doing. They've kind of been overdue for a costume change for a while. It was Faeries, and then it was, Space Brothers and Sisters, and then it was Greys. I think that I wouldn't doubt it. And I don't know. I've been saying this, so we'll see. But I wouldn't doubt it that if, in 20 years, if we're all still around, right? In 20 years, I wouldn't doubt it if people are saying, oh, well, people don't really see the aliens anymore, but the AI killer Boston Dynamics bots came out of their underground server farms to scrape my DNA for their weird cybernetic AI bots that they're creating. I don't know. I could see something like that sort of playing a role too, but it's all a weird time. And at the end of the day, in simplest terms, the UFO and AI both really seem to be, they feel related, and I'm not exactly sure what it is. It might be as simple as making us question evidence more than ever, but it also might be something a little bit more elegant in the fact that both the AI is allowing us to see in real time what the UFO does for only a select few, which is literally reshaping reality. It seems to be something that there's been a democratization of that aspect that was once only held for those people who had UFO contact. I don't know, but I think it's an interesting and terrifying time. Maybe we can take heart in what I said earlier about the rock bottom being the best thing that ever happens to you if you work it right. We'll see where that brings us in a couple of years. Yeah.
And one last question, I'll hand it over to you while I have the stream of thought going. So, I mean, we know that the U.S. government and various systemic authoritative structures have played a huge role in shaping our realities around these phenomena for several decades now. How do you see that in relation to these beings or craft or whatever they are taking or exploiting our stories, our narratives to help shape reality or co-create it? Mm-hmm. Are our systems and our structures doing the same thing?
I think by definition they are, Anthony. I think that that's what the early propagandists learned, is that you can literally, if you can reshape what reality looks like in the minds of your population, how substantively different is that than just literally reshaping reality? I wonder that sometimes, and I think that it may be that the U.S. government, when authority structures in general, are so afraid of what the extraterrestrial revelation will do to the population that they are willing to keep it under lock and key. However, I've been thinking a lot about this ontological shock phrase lately, and I'm becoming increasingly dissatisfied with how often it's being used. It's a great phrase, I think that it has a lot to say about the phenomenon, but at the same time, I have a space on the shelf in my brain that with a label that reads extraterrestrial. Like, there's a place for it, you know what I mean? And if we're dealing in this sort of really malleable version of reality where, who knows, AI doesn't just rewrite what we think about history, but literally retcons history, right? If we live in a version of reality where, collective belief does shape the trajectory or, the reality that we're in, that to me is a lot more ontologically shocky than a bunch of, people from another planet. As I've said before, like which changes your day-to-day version of your life? The idea that reality resembles Close Encounters of the Third Kind, or the idea that reality resembles the Iliad, which is weirder, I know which one I'd answer. So I think that all plays a role, and that would be something that would be significantly important to keep under lock and key, wouldn't it, if you were an authority structure? Similarly, if this does have something to do with death, the idea that, in any sort of state-controlled structure where the ultimate penalty for disobedience is, a monopoly on violence, death doesn't mean as much if that's, if you're an eternal soul. So I think that's something else to consider too. and again, I'm not saying that it's not just as simple as quote unquote simple as extraterrestrials, right? That might be it. But like, these are like, I see as being orders of magnitude more disruptive to, keeping a populace in line. And, I think that in the end, when we look at the phenomenon as a whole, like, there's never really any one answer for things. We'll have a couple of good answers for every individual case, but something that describes the whole of what people are experiencing, it doesn't line up. It's probably a combination of unexplained natural phenomena, misidentifications, collective poltergeist events, interdimensional slips, extraterrestrial visitation even, and of course, government shenanigans. That's the polite way of saying it. Government shenanigans too. I think it's really a sort of a constellation of these things that lie behind the UFO question than any one thing. So that's definitely part of it too. I mean, never let a good cover story go to waste, right?
Yeah, so I kind of want to piggyback on Anthony's question, because you've talked about how phenomena are rooted in archetypes and are kind of, that you feel that they are an expression of a kind of extended form of consciousness that humans are now experiencing, and that is becoming more and more of a collective experience, that we're going to this extended form of consciousness, right? Yet you've also said we're living in this trickster era where, and of course that makes me think about Guillermo del Toro and how he makes us question who or what the monsters really are. And,
right.
Are the monsters the things that obviously simply seem to be the monsters, or is it deeper than that? And what is being a monster, right? Like, what is that, that concept in its entirety? It's certainly not binary, and it's something that we all have within us. We all have a monster inside of us in some way or another. So entertaining that idea, the integration of, our fears, death, the monster idea, and also living in this trickster era where we're not really sure what is so-called real, what isn't, who's tricking us, what is tricking us, this expanded form of consciousness we're going into. Do you think that we're at a crux right now in terms of human evolution of consciousness? And do you think all of these pieces are a deliberate part of what we're supposed to be experiencing right now? Do you think this is a natural part of human evolution? What's your take on that?
I mean, that's a good question. These definitely seem like fraught times. I wonder how much of... So there are two versions of what human history has looked like, right? One is the idea that we have more and faster global communication than we ever have, right? And what happens when you put that many cultures and individuals in communication, in instantaneous communication with each other? What does that do to the manifestation of archetypes and the elevation of consciousness? I don't know. So in that answer, yes, we are at a crossroads. The more chilling version is that this has happened innumerable times before, right? That we have had some degree of technology, or at least communication, even if it doesn't look like technology to us, some degree of communication, with like this in the past at the global level. And that's kind of sobering too, because we don't really have a smoking gun for that, right? There's evidence for it, but we don't have a smoking gun for it. So great things don't always happen when that happens too. So maybe that's part of it too. But I can't help but imagine that, like, much in the same way that, the large language models have come together, or are only feasible by piecing together this sort of global network of knowledge, I can't imagine that something like that isn't happening at the collective field of human consciousness as well. I think it would almost definitionally have to, right? Or rather, I'm of the mindset that something like a global collective unconsciousness has always been lurking there in the background, but we can more easily make it tangible, right, in this sort of day and age of things. So I think that all these things are possible, and I'm not sure if you don't have all this interconnectedness that you aren't going to see stronger manifestations of things like archetypes, that they're not going to sort of become egregorized, the idea of thought forms and tulpas and egregores. Like, these archetypes might grow stronger by all that collective attention and that collective communication that's going in there. I also, quite frankly, I know that every generation says that flying cars are just around the corner, or that the apocalypse is tomorrow, or any number of things like that. But it feels different in 2025. It feels real different, because of how much novelty we have, crashing down on us. And so I think that there is too much compelling anecdotal evidence that we are at sort of a sea change in terms of what we're doing. And again, what I'm referring to is like, cycle models and astrology and things like that. And I think the thing to remember is that, just as we've been talking about, sort of, it's been a recurring theme about how death isn't the end. These deep pits of despair in which we find ourselves are always an opportunity to come back out the other side improved. I mean, that's the near-death experience. That's the shamanic journey too, right? Like, you go to this other place and it's not fun. Depending on the belief system, you might be chopped into 1,000 pieces and then reassembled, but you are put back together better. So I think that that's something to sort of be aware of as we sort of are hurtling towards the end of the decade.
I love that. You're making me think of one of my favorite metaphors, which is this Japanese form of pottery where they make a really beautiful piece of pottery. You've probably heard of this. It sort of alludes to death and change and transition and how it's not always a bad thing. It can be a powerful, beautiful thing. It's called kintsukuroi. It's also called something else, but they make a beautiful piece of pottery. Then they deliberately break it. And then they put it all back together with pure gold.
Yeah, that was wabi-sabi kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea is what is broken can become even more beautiful, become even more whole in a way, right? And makes me think of expressions like the cracks are how the lights get in, right? So we're living in a time where people are thinking of everything as being so dark. If you're paying attention to mainstream news and using that as your main form of information, you think the world is just going to hell in a handbasket. But Anthony and I prefer to look at it as something more of the time of the phoenix. Like, death is transitory. It's transformative. It's powerful in a way. And that it doesn't have to be so scary. It doesn't have to be the end times. It can be a whole new beginning. And so this aspect of the paranormal that you are helping people understand is woven right into our so-called normal lives as a natural occurrence that is happening for people all over the world and always has. It makes me think of that, what you said about it being an expanded or extended form of consciousness for humans now. Right? That we're looking to other sources of meaning, other sources of wisdom and knowledge and learning and evolving. And it's not so much about looking at power structures and what they've been teaching us. It's more about going into these unfamiliar areas where the so-called monsters are and learning from them and learning from that experience. So, yeah.
I love everything you just said. And I also love the fact that you showcased how this is a lesson that we have encoded in our art. Like, and I just think that is so appropriate that even in, we think of art as sort of revealing truths about life in terms of the subject matter or in terms of the, plot or in terms of the color choice or whatever. But like, just the fact that an entire philosophical approach to art, as you alluded to, can be a life lesson or a lesson for these larger perspectives, I think it really gets to the heart of the matter. It gets to the heart of what art is here to do. What art is here to do for us, and what we can do for art.
So agree with that. Yeah, and you're a musician. So do you feel like your music and your creation of music, your creativity in that way, does that infuse your work at all? Like, do you feel like that's a form of connection for you? Do you have any experiences via your music?
Yeah, I kind of like to keep it partitioned, to be really honest. I kind of like to keep it separate from a lot of the stuff because I find both domains, both the writing and the music, frustrating from time to time, and it's nice to completely retreat to the other. But there has been a little bit of crossover, and I will say that for me, it's not so much the art itself, but it's the making of the art where I find those sort of little transcendental moments. So it's the act of, the thing that I find refreshing about music is that it is a collective cooperative effort. And when you find those moments of connection on stage, like, that's when I'm like, oh, I'm plugged into this like mini localized neural network between me and the other guys in the band or something like that. We just had a show last night and a couple of moments felt a little bit like that, where we all switched at the same time. And it's like, yeah, we didn't rehearse that. We just all sort of like switched at the same time. So like that's sort of an expression where I find that, coming over, my interest in this bleeding over into that. I can't always say that the inverse is noted, although I will say that, that my time in graduate school certainly fostered an appreciation for citations and notes and things like that. So maybe that has a little bit of carryover there too.
Josh, earlier you mentioned this term hierarchical realities. Can you explain a bit what you meant by that? And like, does that relate in any way to concepts of time and space in relation to us, in relation to these phenomena, and in relation to the formless?
Right. So I suppose what I was driving at was initially within the frame of the narratological perspective. So this idea of breaking the fourth wall in metalepsis is about characters acknowledging the audience, or narrators acknowledging characters and interacting with them. So those are the sort of transgressions that we're talking about. But we do see those sort of nested realities in a variety of different cosmologies. And even in some of the simpler ones that aren't as elaborate as, the multiple realms of Norse mythology or something, you've still got underworlds and overworlds. And, roughly speaking, the underworld is past and the overworld, or the sky, is future, right? And so it's, of course, the futuristic aliens come from above, and the primitive Bigfoot step out of caves from below, right? Makes perfect sense. But yeah, so that's sort of, I guess it's the acknowledgement of these. They may not be literally above or below, but they operate with, I would suspect that these other realities operate with varying degrees of autonomy and supersede ours to some degree. So, depending on what you believe in, that might be an afterlife, or it might be, a creator, or it might be functioning at the level of Akashic records or the astral plane or something. But these all speak to the same idea that what we're experiencing here is a rather limited version of what is capable, and the possibilities that are at that super situated stratum.
Love that. I'm going to dive in. I want to go back to what you were saying about the fourth wall. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is I studied some theater in school, and I was fascinated by Bertolt Brecht and his idea of the fourth wall in relation to live theatrical performances, being on stage, and how actors would use the fourth wall as either something that was present or something that wasn't. You break through the fourth wall, or you pretend it's there, right? You acknowledge that it's there between you and the audience. So you utilize that in a way I haven't seen before. And I wanted to ask you, in the context of theater and how reality, we think this is reality. It is not necessarily reality. It's certainly not as physical as we think that it is. Physics has told us that solid things are an illusion. Our bodies are supposedly solid, but they're really not. So questioning what reality really is, and alluding to commonly known phrases like Shakespeare said, all the world's a stage, men and women are simply players. Do you think that part of what's going on is that we are playing roles, that this is not reality, this is some sort of form of theater, and that the phenomena is partially our audience, partially other participants? What do you think about that idea?
Oh, yeah. I mean, so for the next 3 hours, we'll be diving into no, I mean, I
yes,
think that
please.
I think that I offer people multiple ways to interpret this. They can take it as literally or as metaphorically as they want, but I think at the end of the day, there's a real strength in looking at the phenomenon this way. And for me, it helps make sense of a lot of the more theatrical aspects of the phenomenon that does seem to really enjoy speaking to us in symbols and whatnot. I think if you look at media where a character truly breaks that fourth wall, and it's not just like a passing joke or something, or a one-off, where it really becomes like a realization that they have, it so closely mirrors the experience of becoming open to this greater reality, which, I call it the paranormal or the supernatural interchangeably. People might quibble with the definitions, but just the idea that this is not everything there is. There's something both empowering and existentially terrifying about realizing that, whether you're a character realizing that you're in a piece of media, or you're a human being realizing that this reality is this. It's the same reaction. Mm-hmm. But what is so interesting is that, while that can lead to existential despair, it can lead to something that's incredibly empowering and allow you to sort of adjust and expand. I don't know who the audience is. I think that I think the audience might be our higher selves. I mean, like, who's, I guess, the audience for the audience of a video game is also the player, right? So
Yeah.
there's control while also consuming, so it's sort of a blending of those two things. So perhaps the audience is the higher self. And that would make sense why, interacting with that audience or acknowledging the existence of that audience sort of empowers you to be able to change things in your life. But, a lot of where this sort of stemmed from was not only those ideas of fictional characters stepping into life, but this idea that was sort of first proposed by John Keel, and I've heard multiple variations of it over the years, but it's called, Keel called it the reflective factor, which is this idea of like, once you look at the phenomenon looks back. Your mileage may vary, mine certainly has, but roughly speaking, like once you let this thing into your life, like it is in your life and it sort of lets you into its world. Even if that's just on an intellectual level, I think that that's true. And that seems like a very apt metaphor for this idea of fourth wall breaks or for metalepsis. And then once you throw into that the fact that the very act of crossing that boundary is a trickster attribute, then it's like, oh, of course this fits the paranormal really well. So I think that there are a lot of different ways to interpret it. I think that if you interpret it too literally, it kind of leads to madness probably because, you end up viewing everything as a construct, and that's why I sort of encourage people to take these ideas with that open-handed approach. But if you can also take it as sort of a half-truth, and it helps you sort of make sense of things. And honestly, the reason that I opened up Fourth Wall Phantoms with my recovery is to show that this idea has real stakes. It has real life consequences, and that it can be used, if applied with care, to give you an idea or a blueprint of best practices for a living. And I'm not saying that as a prescription to people to turn their lives around or anything like that. I'm just saying that I know that I was able to figure out where I was in my life by comparing it to something like the hero's journey. And sitting there in rehab and being like, oh, I'm in the belly of the whale. And like, I can be a side character that just gets digested in the whale, or I can really integrate that sort of Joseph Campbell hero's journey aspect and like see this through to the conclusion that I think the universe wants me to follow. Carl Jung compared archetypes to dried riverbeds, that once there's enough rainfall, like that's the route that the rivers will take. And so that's sort of the way that I looked at it, is like, okay, well, what is the path of least resistance that God, the universe, destiny, whatever you want to call it, wants me to take? What is that path of least resistance? And the good news is, I think that reality wants you to succeed. Reality wants you to become the hero and to slay the dragon. I really do think that.
Yeah, me too.
And so if you can realize where you've caused the story, the archetype of the story, to malfunction, you have an opportunity to course correct and perhaps, improve your station in life.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting you brought this up, because the hero's journey. A few months ago, I was listening to an episode by my friends Kelly Chase and J. Christopher King on their podcast Cosmosis. And they were talking about like how some people are starting to use AI tools for like therapeutic help. And I forgot the name of some of the apps, but they're out there. And some people are getting this interesting responses sometimes that fit with this hero's journey notion, and linking it back to certain legends or myths, even like telling them that there's some prince from Atlantis like reborn or something like that. And I found it interesting because it fits with some of the things that experiencers have been told by some of these non-human intelligences in some cases, or deities and things like that. Like, what do you think is happening there, and what would be like what would be your warning or recommendation for people in these situations, whether it's dealing with AI or NHI, if they're different?
That is wild. And I think that's such a prescient observation, making that comparison, because you're right. Like, like how many prophesied apocalypses have come and gone from the UFO occupants telling us these things. And it's the same thing that people get with hypnotic regressions too. Like, oh, you were Cleopatra too? Oh, awesome. Well, so was I, or you were Napoleon as well, So I that is really striking, though, that you see those sort of similarities. And I don't, man, that's so insightful. I don't really know what it points to other than this unshakable sense that I alluded to earlier, which is that there's something connected between the AI thing and the UFO UAP thing. I don't know what it is. It might just be that. But in some ways, now that I think about it, if we're developing AI in parallel to the UFO experience, that kind of seems less likely than the fact that they're related somehow. I don't know what to do with that, Anthony, but I think you're absolutely right. I think that you're absolutely right. Like these sort of grandiose, this sort of apocryphal ego inflation, right?
Yeah.
is really a fascinating thread to pull on, and I'm going to keep on thinking about that because,
like, is it
yeah.
something Machiavellian that they're just, it could be done to justify the ends?
Yeah, I mean, part of me. So something that I've been thinking about for a long time too is that the reason that AI is so compelling and seems to have sort of cracked that, why the current models have sort of cracked seemingly that AI code that we've been searching for forever, is because they are large language models. We realize that language is like the thing that allows us to present a facade of consciousness, right? And then the more you think about it, the more you're like, well, we are large language models too. Like, how many phrases have I used today that are just like on the tip of my tongue, that I've, clusters of sentences that I've used that are on the tip of my tongue. I mean, tip of my tongue is one, right? So it might speak to the fact that, just as, this is just me spitballing here, so I'm theorizing, just as the large language models are almost an epiphenomena of reading between the lines and of what is essentially like our informational unconscious, that the UFO is operating on a similar function with our actual psychological unconscious. I don't know. Really don't know, but I think you're absolutely right, and that demands more attention.
This is making me think about, oh gosh, forgive me, it's the title of, I think, an event that you were assisting at with Jeffrey Kripal. The Soul is a UFO, I believe it was. That I really love that concept. This is something I've been thinking about for a long time, is, especially now that we have orbs coming in more and more and more, and people are starting to entertain. As you were saying, the UFO has changed over decades. And so now orbs are one of the newest expressions of a UAP or UFO, and they seem to be alive. They seem to be made of consciousness. People have talked about how seemingly physical UFOs that they end up in are become joined or conjoined with their consciousness, and then they can run the UFO, make it do what they want simply by thinking about it. That UFOs are themselves conscious, like a ship that we see in the sky is a conscious thing. It's a being, it's alive, it's intelligent. There's so many ways to expand that. And it makes me go back to what you were saying about the phenomenon being possibly an expanded form of human consciousness. Like, that's really what I'm latching onto most from your most recent work, because there are, people have talked about, and I've experienced this myself, downloads or bits of information that say that we are UFOs, that the human is some kind of UFO, or the human is, a conscious entity that seems to be physical, but is not really. And we can travel in all these different ways, right? We can astral travel. We can go out into space. We can leave our bodies. Do you think that the human is a form of technology, and that we have not yet become aware? Like, forget AI, and UFOs. Are we a form of technology that has not yet developed, and maybe is in a phase now of developing into becoming a much more sophisticated pieces of technology collectively that can result in a different reality or different outcome for humans?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. Number one, I'm doing the event with Kevin Can and Dr. Kripal at the in December, so it hasn't happened yet. But I really like where you're thinking with this, because I've kind of wondered, as we've been talking about globalization and whatnot, like, as we become a more global culture, regional interpretations and idiosyncrasies of all kinds are getting flattened out. And I kind of wonder if that's why we are seeing more of basically a pure, more distilled version of the phenomenon, right? So instead of getting a bunch of elaborate sort of craft or angels or all these sort of like really culturally dependent things, we're getting lights in the sky. Instead of getting these sort of abductions that are mired in surgical pageantry, we're getting like just extended consciousness moments or downloads or things like that, which seems to be a trend as well. But to your point on, are we technology? I think yes. And I think part of that hinges on, we need to have a more inclusive definition of what technology is, right? So like I'm of the opinion that plant medicine is a technology, or specifically something that has sort of an additive component to it, like ayahuasca, is a sort of technology. It's a technology that we wouldn't recognize because we've been entrained to recognize technology as silica and metal and electricity. But I think that there are multiple versions of technology. And all this in turn brings me to an idea put forth by my friend Miguel Romero, Red Pill Junkie, who suggested long before sort of the current AI era that we're in, that any sufficiently complex system will sort of attract or draw in that spark of consciousness. And I think that there might be something to that in terms of how complex our brain is. In other words, it's not that we have consciousness from the complexity of our brain. It's that the complexity of our brain attracted something that's already out there and sort of invited it in. It's almost like a very literal version of Dr. Frankenstein's monster, except, well, yeah, I mean, he cobbled together the corpse from many other bodies and just waited for lightning to strike. Well, we're, in this case, the Frankenstein body is also the lightning rod at the same time, and it attracts or invites this stuff in. And so, yeah, I think that part of that, it does imply that, an upgrade might be forthcoming. I don't know. I don't really know which angle it's going to come from. There are certainly those people who are telling us to become more like cyborgs. Although we've technically been cyborgs ever since we started wearing glasses, right? Like, we are already cyborgs. But to become more fully integrated with the machine, like, that might be the right way, although I'm going to wait a little bit longer to see if something a little bit more natural happens between now and then. But I think that you're definitely onto something with that line of thought.
Thank you. Anthony?
Well, I know you don't have too much time left, Josh, so we wanted to thank you for joining us. And can you share a bit before you go about your December event and what people could look forward to?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. You can find out more information about this through the links that are on my website, joshuacutchin.com, JOSHUACUTCHIN.com, just like a cut on your chin.
We'll put it in the description.
Okay. But this is December 5th through 7th at the Esalen Institute. As I've been saying, it would be like just being at Esalen, like on a tour or something, was kind of a bucket list item for me, but to be involved in any sort of official capacity is more than I ever could have hoped for. So I will be the workshop assistant for Dr. Kreipel and Kevin Cahn's workshop, The Soul is a UFO. Understanding and Embracing Transcendence is the subtitle. We are going to explore a lot of Kevin's philosophies on Platonic surrealism, which is just barely covered a little bit in Jeff's book, How to Think Impossibly. But Platonic surrealism is a concept that I've been sort of training with Kevin to gain a better fluency in. And I think it sort of does sand off some of the more difficult aspects of the phenomenon to reconcile. And what I mean by that is that it sort of, once you sort of integrate some of the primary concepts surrounding potentiality and will and what human beings are and look like, that it helps to make a lot of things that seem like contradictions with the phenomenon seem a little bit more natural. And it does have a certain predictive quality to it. I'm not going to get into it right now because it's way too confusing to get into, but we'll be unpacking a lot of that with commentary from Dr. Kreipel, and if I'm invited, from myself as well. But it really does sort of tap into a lot of the themes of Fourth Wall Phantoms. It's kind of serendipitous that book came out this year, because it's all about the sort of concept of authorship and ownership of the trajectory that you're on, and how our relationship with this other reality informs and guides that as well. So all these things sort of play together really nicely and all happen to come to a head at the same time. So maybe there's something in the water that suggests that now's the time to discuss it. So it's the 5th through the 7th at Esalen in California.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us, Josh.
Oh, it was an absolute pleasure.
I want to wrap up by saying that I know We've alluded to two of your heroes, Valet and John Keel, but I know that Terence McKenna is another one of your heroes, and you mentioned that you're not fit to tie their shoelaces, but you sort of tend their gardens. So I would say to you that you're helping to nourish and grow the food of the gods and share that with others. And we really, really value that about you a lot. So thank you so much, Josh, for being here and also for sharing your recovery journey. That's really powerful stuff. I would love to hear more about that at some point. So we hope to have you back. And thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and your wonderful vocabulary. I was eating that up. And we're definitely going to direct people to your work and encourage them to discover the world that you've created through your books.
Well, thank you so much. I don't think I've heard a more heartwarming send-off from a show that I've done, so that means a lot to me. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Josh. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us and watching this interview. Please support our show by liking, subscribing, commenting, and send us your questions. Take part in our community, and thank you again.